They ordered her to roll up her sleeve in front of 200 recruits, and the moment the tattoo came into view, the colonel's face drained of all color because what he saw inked into her skin wasn't just forbidden. It was the kind of marking that only existed in classified files, the kind that meant he had just publicly humiliated someone who could end his career with a single phone call. But that realization came later. It started earlier that morning, in the suffocating heat of Parris Island, where the sun turned the parade deck into a furnace and 200 Marine recruits stood locked at attention, sweat already soaking through their PT, here despite the early hour. This was the kind of formation that didn't happen by accident. It was deliberate, designed to make a point, to reinforce discipline through public example. And Colonel Marcus Brennan was very good at making points. He stood at the front of the formation, hands clasped behind his back, his uniform pressed to razor sharpness, his presence commanding in that way that came from decades of unquestioned authority. He didn't need to raise his voice to make people listen. He just needed to exist. Behind him, a row of drill instructors stood equally rigid, their faces carved from stone, their eyes scanning the formation for any weakness, any deviation from perfection. And then there was her. She stood near the edge of the group, not in formation exactly, but adjacent to it. A blonde woman in her late 20s wearing a faded gray athletic shirt and black running pants. Her hair pulled back into a simple ponytail. No rank, no insignia, nothing that marked her as military at all. She looked like she'd just wandered onto the base for a morning jog. And that was the problem. One of the drill instructors had noticed her first, his eyes narrowing as she passed too close to the formation, moving with a calm, unhurried stride that suggested she had every right to be there. But to him, she didn't. Not dressed like that. Not during his formation. "Ma'am," he barked, stepping forward. "This is a restricted training area." She'd stopped, turned slowly, her expression neutral. "I'm aware. Then you need to clear the deck." She didn't move, didn't argue, just stood there, hands resting loosely at her sides, her posture balanced and controlled in a way that should have been a warning but wasn't. "Now," the drill instructor added, his voice hardening. And still, she didn't move. That's when Colonel Brennan noticed. He turned his head slightly, his gaze locking onto the scene unfolding at the edge of his formation. And the moment he saw her, civilian clothes, no visible ID, standing defiant in front of one of his instructors, something tightened in his chest. Not concern, irritation, because this was his parade deck, his formation, his standards, and she was disrupting all of it. He walked forward, slow and deliberate, the sound of his boots cutting through the silence as 200 recruits held their breath, sensing that something was about to happen. "Is there a problem here?" Brennan asked, his voice calm but carrying an edge that made it clear he already knew the answer. The drill instructor straightened. "Sir, this individual refuses to clear the training area." Brennan's eyes shifted to her, taking in every detail. The casual clothes, the lack of deference, the complete absence of anything that suggested she understood the situation she was in. "Name," he said flatly. "Keller," she replied. No rank, no explanation, just her name. "Keller," Brennan repeated, his tone turning colder. "You're standing in the middle of a Marine Corps training exercise. You don't belong here." "I was told to report to this location at 0600, she said evenly. "By who?" "Command." Brennan's jaw tightened. "What command?" She didn't answer immediately, and that silence felt like defiance. "I don't know who you think you are," Brennan said, stepping closer. "But you don't walk onto my deck dressed like you're going to the gym and expect to be taken seriously." Her expression didn't change, not even slightly. And that calm, that absolute lack of reaction, made something inside him snap. "Roll up your sleeve," he ordered suddenly. The demand hung in the air, sharp and unexpected. She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes steady, unblinking. "Sir," one of the drill instructors said quietly, uncertain. "I said roll it up," Brennan repeated, louder now, his voice cutting across the formation. "If you're military, you'll have ink. Everyone does. Let's see what kind of person we're dealing with." It was a test, a public one, designed to expose her as exactly what he believed she was, someone pretending to belong somewhere she didn't. The recruits watched, frozen, and slowly, without breaking eye contact, she reached down and began rolling up her left sleeve. Higher, higher, until the tattoo came into view. And the moment Colonel Brennan saw it, His entire body went rigid. Because what was inked into her skin wasn't a unit insignia or a motivational phrase or even a combat memorial. It was a single symbol, small and precise, positioned just below her shoulder. A trident, a skull, an anchor. MARSOC, Marine Special Operations Command. But it wasn't just that. Beneath it, in clean, deliberate script, was a call sign he'd only ever seen in classified briefings. Reaper. And in that instant, everything he thought he knew shattered completely. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was suffocating, the kind of silence that happens when an entire formation of people realizes they're watching something catastrophic unfold in real time. Colonel Brennan stood frozen, his eyes locked on the tattoo, his mind racing to catch up with what his instincts were already screaming at him. He knew that call sign. Everyone at his level knew that call sign. Reaper wasn't just a name. It was a legend whispered in secure briefings and after-action reports that never made it past classified channels. A MARSOC operator who had been part of operations so deep that even acknowledging their existence required clearance most people would never have. And he had just ordered her to prove herself in front of 200 recruits like she was some lost civilian. Brennan's face had gone pale, the color draining so fast that one of the drill instructors actually took a half step forward, concerned. "Sir?" the instructor said quietly. Brennan didn't respond. He couldn't, because now he was seeing everything differently. The way she stood, the control in her posture, the complete lack of fear when he'd confronted her. None of it had been defiance. It had been patience. She had let him make his assumptions. Let him escalate. Let him create this moment in front of everyone. And now there was no way to undo it. "Colonel," she said quietly, her voice calm and steady, cutting through the silence like a blade. "Would you like me to continue?" It wasn't sarcastic. It wasn't mocking. It was a genuine question, asked with the kind of control that only came from someone who had been in far worse situations than this and survived. Brennan's mouth opened, but no words came out immediately. His mind was still caught between his authority and the growing realization that he had just crossed a line he couldn't uncross. He started, then stopped, his voice faltering in a way it never had before. Behind him, the formation remained locked in place, but the tension had shifted. The recruits couldn't see the tattoo from where they stood, but they could see the colonel's reaction, and that was enough. Something had gone very, very wrong. One of the senior drill instructors, a gunnery sergeant named Ortiz who had been on the deck long enough to recognize when a situation was spiraling, stepped forward carefully. "Sir," he said quietly, his voice low enough that only Brennan and Keller could hear. "Respectfully, we should move this off the deck." Brennan's jaw tightened, but he nodded once, sharp and mechanical. "Dismissed," he said to the formation, his voice rough. "Drill instructors, take over." The order rippled through the ranks, and within seconds, the recruits were moving, filing off the parade deck under the sharp commands of their instructors, their eyes still glancing back toward the scene they didn't fully understand but knew they'd remember. Within a minute, the deck was empty except for Brennan, Keller, and Ortiz. The heat pressed down harder now, the sun climbing higher, turning the asphalt into a griddle. But none of them moved. Brennan finally forced himself to speak, his voice quieter now, stripped of the authority it had carried before. "You're Captain Ava Keller." It wasn't a question. It was a confirmation, spoken like a man trying to convince himself it wasn't true. "Yes, sir," she said. He exhaled slowly, his shoulders dropping just slightly. "You were ordered here by MARSOC Command for the interoperability training brief." "Correct. And I just—" He stopped himself, the words catching in his throat. Keller didn't finish the sentence for him. She didn't need to. Ortiz shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flicking between them. He'd been around long enough to know when someone had made a career-altering mistake, and this was one of them. Brennan straightened, trying to regain some semblance of control. "Captain, I apologize. That was unnecessary," she said, her tone even, but not unprecedented. The words landed harder than an accusation would have, because she wasn't angry. She wasn't offended. She was just stating a fact, and that fact was that this had happened before. People seeing her and making assumptions based on what they expected instead of what was in front of them. Brennan's hands clenched briefly at his sides before he forced them to relax. "I made a judgment call based on incomplete information," he said carefully. "You made a judgment call based on appearance," she corrected, still calm. There's a difference. Silence settled again, heavier this time. Ortiz cleared his throat softly. Sir, the brief is scheduled to start in 15 minutes. Command will be expecting both of you. Brennan nodded slowly, then looked at Keller again, something shifting in his expression, not quite respect yet, but awareness. After you, Captain, he said quietly. Keller gave a small nod, then turned and walked toward the administration building, her stride steady and unhurried, exactly as it had been when this all started. Brennan watched her go, then exhaled hard, running a hand over his face. She let me do it, he said quietly, almost to himself. Ortiz didn't respond immediately. Then, carefully, he said, Yes, sir. She did. Why? Because she knew you'd learn more from it than she would from stopping you. Brennan's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue, because deep down, he knew it was true. And as he followed her toward the building, one thought settled into his mind with uncomfortable clarity. The most dangerous person in the room isn't always the one who speaks the loudest. Sometimes, it's the one who doesn't need to speak at all. The briefing room was cold, sterile, and filled with senior officers who had been waiting for the session to begin. Maps covered the walls. Tactical displays glowed on mounted screens. A long table stretched down the center, surrounded by colonels, majors, and a two-star general seated at the head. When Colonel Brennan walked in, every eye turned toward him. Professional, expectant. Then Captain Ava Keller stepped in behind him, still in her plain athletic gear, and the room went silent in a different way. Confused, uncertain. The general's eyes narrowed slightly. Colonel Brennan, who is this? Brennan opened his mouth, but before he could speak, Keller stepped forward, calm and direct. Captain Ava Keller, MARSOC. I'm here to deliver the interoperability brief. The general's expression shifted immediately, from confusion to recognition, then to something close to respect. Captain Keller, he said, standing. We've been expecting you. Several of the other officers exchanged glances, clearly unfamiliar with the name, but reading the room well enough to understand that this person mattered. Keller gave a small nod and moved to the front of the room without hesitation, pulling up a tactical file on the main screen with practiced efficiency. Brennan took his seat quietly, his face still tight, his mind still replaying the last hour in painful detail. For the next 40 minutes, Keller walked the room through one of the most detailed and precise operational breakdowns Brennan had ever witnessed. She spoke with clarity and control, answering questions from senior officers with the kind of depth that only came from first-hand experience. She didn't posture, didn't oversell, just delivered the information with the same calm she'd shown on the parade deck. And the room listened. When the brief ended, the general stood again. Outstanding work, Captain. Thank you, sir, she said simply, then gathered her materials and stepped toward the door. But before she could leave, the general's voice stopped her. Captain Keller. She turned. I understand there was an incident earlier this morning. Brennan's stomach dropped. Keller's expression didn't change. There was a misunderstanding, sir. It's been resolved. The general's eyes shifted briefly to Brennan, then back to her. Noted. She gave a short nod and left. The room remained silent for a long moment after the door closed. Then the general turned to Brennan, his expression unreadable. Colonel, a word. 20 minutes later, Brennan stood alone outside the building, the afternoon heat pressing down on him as he stared at the empty parade deck. He'd been dressed down. Not loudly, not publicly, but thoroughly. The general had made it clear that what happened on that deck reflected poorly not just on Brennan, but on the entire command. That assumptions based on appearance undermined the very principles they were supposed to be instilling in recruits. And that if Captain Keller hadn't been as professional as she was, the situation could have escalated into something far worse. Brennan knew he was right. He also knew he was lucky. Footsteps approached from behind. He turned to see Gunnery Sergeant Ortiz. Sir, Ortiz said carefully. Captain Keller just left the base. She asked me to pass along a message. Brennan straightened slightly. What message? She said. Tell the colonel that the best leaders are the ones who learn from their mistakes instead of defending them. Brennan exhaled slowly, the weight of the words settling into him. She's right, he said quietly. Ortiz nodded. Yes, sir. She is. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Brennan turned back toward the parade deck, watching as a new group of recruits began forming up in the distance. Ortiz, he said, his voice steadier now. "I want every drill instructor on this base in a briefing tomorrow morning. Sir, we're going to talk about assumptions, about respect, about what it means to lead people who don't look like what we expect them to look like." Ortiz's expression shifted slightly, not quite a smile but close. "Yes, sir." Brennan nodded once, then started walking back toward the admin building, his stride purposeful again. Because he couldn't undo what had happened that morning, but he could make damn sure it never happened again. 3 weeks later, a new training protocol was implemented across Parris Island. Every incoming instructor now received mandatory briefings on unconscious bias, respect across ranks, and the importance of verification before confrontation. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't publicized. But it was real. And it started because one quiet, blonde woman in her late 20s let a colonel make a mistake in front of 200 people. Not to humiliate him, but to teach him something he wouldn't forget. Because the most powerful lessons aren't the ones you're told. They're the ones you live through. And Colonel Marcus Brennan would carry that lesson for the rest of his career.